One of the reasons I left academia is because I think power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I don't actually have a PowerPoint presentation today, but I do have one slide that I'll put up. The upside of not having any slides is if you've got any questions at any time, please just stick your hand up. And my plan is really only to speak for 20 or 25 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions, because the content of what I've got to say is quite simple, but the implications are well, there's some challenges and there's also a few questions about what is and isn't either desirable or politically pragmatic. So I'm just going to talk for 20 minutes or so about what I see as a big problem and what I think is a simple solution, but history and personal experience tells me that simple solutions aren't so simple to implement. So hence why hopefully there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So let's just start at the beginning. I'm an economist, I'm not a climate scientist, but Mark and I were talking about this before. For the last 25 years I've been aware of overwhelming scientific evidence to suggest that we shouldn't burn as many fossil fuels if we don't want to have dangerous climate change. Over that 25 years the science has only got worse, scarier and more certain, yet over that 25 years we've, let me choose my words carefully here, done virtually nothing. Greenhouse gas emissions have risen by 50% since the world agreed in the early 90s to tackle climate change. Right, so we agreed it was a problem, we agreed we needed to do something. Indeed, we even agreed that rich countries should act before poor countries. We agreed to all this when I was an undergraduate at university. And ever since then, what we've done is extract more fossil fuels, burn more fossil fuels, and rapidly increase emissions. So I guess I'm a bit cynical in the lead up to Paris that we'll have yet another announcement from global political leaders where, you know, I hate to say it, some people here younger than me, some people think that world leaders promising to tackle climate change feels like we're getting somewhere. Well, actually we've been there. We've heard it before and we haven't seen it yet. So that's the big picture. I think climate change is important. I think we need to radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think we need to do that sooner rather than later. Step one. Step two, my country, the representatives of my country, Australia, have got the exact opposite intention. So in the lead up to Paris, with everyone talking about we need to tackle climate change and, you know, what's my fair share and what sort of timelines and baselines and all sorts of things that no one can follow. The Australian government is doing what it's always been doing, and that is planning another massive expansion in our coal production. Okay, so it's great that people in Europe want to tackle climate change. Great. It's great that you think something might happen in Paris. Fantastic. What we're doing in Australia is planning to double our coal exports. Now, Australia already has a larger share of the world traded coal market than Saudi Arabia has of the world oil market. Okay, now coal is different from oil in many ways, but the main way is that a lot of coal is landlocked. It's not traded. It's in the middle of Russia, it's in the middle of China, it's in the middle of countries sitting next to coal-fired power stations. It's not bought and sold, it's just dug up and burnt. But the coal that is sold around the world, indeed the buyers and sellers that set the world price, that's the seaborne coal market, the traded coal market. Again, Australia has a bigger share of that than the Saudis have the oil market. Now, if someone told you the Saudis were planning to double their oil supply, what do you think would happen to the price of oil? You reckon it might go up or go down? Go down. Just checking if we're listening. So if Australia, with a larger share of the world coal market than Saudi Arabia has the world oil market, if Australia's planning to double its coal output, then you should assume the coal price is going to fall. Australia is not actually the biggest supplier of coal in the traded market. That honour now goes to Indonesia. Do you know what Indonesia's planning to do? Double its coal output. So it's fantastic that we're all getting ready to agree that we're going to tackle climate change through binding agreements. But countries like Australia and countries like Indonesia, who are huge in the traded coal market, are planning to do the opposite. We're planning to double our coal output. Now, we'll come back to the sort of the politics and the economics of that, but let's just get the simple stuff out of the way at the beginning. The Australian government, the Indonesian government, does not think the world is going to promise to do anything in December this year that would preclude us from building this coal. This is one coal mine proposed for Australia. It's the Adani Carmichael mine. The pit will be 40 kilometres long and 10 kilometres wide. This is one mine. I don't know if you can see, but that red circle in the middle, that's the metropolitan area of Paris. You can see Versailles off there on the left. If we put this image up for London, you would see that this mine stretches from, is it Slough? Through central London and as far out the other side. This is one mine that we're planning to build. There are 3 mines this big in the same region that have all been proposed. This is the one that's just the most furthest advanced, the Adani Carmichael mine. The previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, thought this mine was central to Australia's economic development. The previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, mentioned it in virtually every speech he gave. The Australian government will subsidise this mine in order to make sure it gets built. Why do I know this? A, because the Australian government has talked about the need to subsidise this mine, and B, the Australian government has subsidised every large coal mine built in Australia. That's what we do. We build mines and we subsidise them. So this mine, this one single mine, will produce around 2 billion tonnes of coal over its life, which is enough to make a pile of coal 1 metre deep, 10 metres wide, let's say the width of this room, 200,000 kilometres long. You'd get around the world 5 times on a road of coal 1 metre deep with the coal from this one mine. Did I mention it was just one? We've got 3 mines this big on the books with another 50 mines. Not nearly this big, but another 50 mines that we're hoping to build in the coming years. So the world talks about tackling climate change, and countries with coal are planning to dig up record amounts of it, so someone is wrong. Someone is going to lose. Either Australia's coal export plans fall in a heap, or the world's climate plans fall in a heap. But there is no scenario in which the world that's tackling climate change needs mines like this built. So, why is this happening? A couple of reasons. One, you might have seen, if you've looked carefully, there's been a number of financial and economic analyses of these mines. I've conducted some of them myself, been involved in the court cases around this mine. Excuse me. These mines, you'll often find finance analysts saying, oh, they're not economic, they won't go ahead. Well, there's a phrase missing from that sentence. They're not economic, they won't go ahead, comma, unless they're subsidised. They will go ahead if they're subsidised. This needs a 400 kilometre railway line to be built to connect this lump of coal, which is 400 kilometres inland from the Great Barrier Reef, to a port that is yet to be built on the Great Barrier Reef. The people that are proposing this mine aren't stupid. They're not going to risk $3 billion of their own money to build a railway line. But if they can get the Australian government to, that'd be a good start. Similarly, the port that will need to be built to handle 40 million tonnes of coal a year just from this mine, 100 million tonnes a year through the port, that port hasn't been built, needs to be massively expanded. The taxpayer will probably pick up the tab for that. So the economics of this, in a nutshell, involve the fact that if the government, if the taxpayer picks up the upfront costs, the fixed costs, and all the miner has to do is deal with the variable costs, the ongoing costs, then there's very little risk to the miner, because every day they operate is a profitable day, and if they don't operate for long, then it's the taxpayer that blew all their money on the upfront investment. So we all know that the coal price is pretty low at the moment. Companies like Glencore are doing it tough. Peabody's doing it tough. Atlas is doing it tough. It's not a great time to invest in coal. Yet here I am telling you that the world's largest mine is getting proposed to extract just that. Why would anybody think now is a good time to build a new coal mine? Well, it's a really simple and interesting idea known as the green paradox that explains pretty much exactly why this is what you'd expect. Admittedly, the people that came up with it weren't thinking about mega coal mines, but the tools work quite well. Let me start with an analogy. I don't know, I'm from Australia, apologies, but in Australia, summer's a nice place to hang out by the beach, and we have these kind of trucks that show up and sell ice cream. You know, they play green sleeves and the kids come. You know what I'm talking about?
Me too.
Yeah, you got them here too? Good. Right, imagine you own one of those trucks. It's full of ice cream, and the fridge broke. You have a truck full of melting ice cream. What would you do with it?
Sell it fast.
Sell it as quick as you can. It's going to be worthless soon. Might as well have a sale. Now imagine you owned 1 trillion tonnes of coal. Imagine you owned 1 trillion tonnes of coal and you thought, I reckon in 30 years' time I won't be able to sell this. I reckon in 30 years' time people might have actually got around to doing something about tackling climate change. Well, if you owned 1 trillion tonnes of coal and you thought the world might get around to doing something serious about climate change, what would you do with the coal? Dig it up. That's exactly what we're proposing to do. So you'd like to think, perhaps, that as the coal price falls, supply will fall and we'll all tackle climate change and everything will be alright. But the green paradox suggests a rather alarming possibility. The possibility that we might do something about tackling climate change. Come in, you're right. The green paradox says that the possibility that we might want to tackle climate change in the future is a great reason to dig up coal as fast as you can now. Now, economists typically try and model, forecast, predict, understand the rate at which we pull natural resources out of the ground via something called Hotelling's rule. And Hotelling basically tells us that if you own an asset that's in the ground, if you part of you wants to dig it all up and sell it tomorrow, because then you get the cash, and economists think getting cash today is better than getting cash in the future. But we also know if we dig it all up and sell it now, we'll push the price down and we won't get much for it. So Hotelling's principle basically allows us to kind of understand the optimal rate at which someone who owned 1 trillion tonnes of coal would pull it out of the ground. But Hotelling's principle doesn't have deadlines in it that says, but you've got to sell all your coal by a particular date. So unfortunately, again I'm an economist, apologies for that, my colleagues in economics have usually done our analysis of climate policy on the standard economic assumption of ceteris paribus. Anyone know what that means?
Everything else being equal.
How can we say it in Latin? Does it sound so stupid in English? Ceteris paribus, all other things remaining equal. So all other things remaining equal, we tell ourselves that introducing a carbon price or introducing an emissions trading scheme or doing anything will reduce demand for coal and push up the price a bit, and we'll all be on the path towards tackling climate change, all other things being equal. But the green paradox says, what if the mere act of introducing a modest climate policy triggers this massive reaction from the people that own the coal? What if you basically start a stampede to the door with everybody thinking, well, I was happy to sit on my coal for another 50 or 100 years, but if I can't sell it in 50 years' time, it's worthless to me. I'd rather get $1 for it today than nothing in the future. So the green paradox tells us that the behaviour of Adani, the behaviour of Shenhua, the behaviour of a lot of the big coal companies is perfectly rational. So with that in mind, so let's recap. Australia is planning to double its coal exports. The world is planning to tackle climate change. One of us is going to lose. Okay? There's no scenario in which us doubling coal exports and you tackling climate change are both going to happen. So step one, there is a collision between the words at Paris and the actions in countries like Australia and Indonesia. Step two, this is actually explicable. When you understand the green paradox, when you understand that people want to sell an asset before it's not worth anything, and when you understand that these mines are heavily subsidised, then what looks like irrational action actually becomes rational. Step three, what on earth can we do about it? So I'll just say a few words about that and then I'm happy to take questions. So President Tong of Kiribati has called recently for a moratorium on all new coal mines. Kiribati is a tiny South Pacific island country. Its largest island is smaller than that mine. Kiribati, if you hear President Tong speak, you couldn't get a more articulate and passionate advocate for tackling climate change. Kiribati hopes that the world will do enough to tackle climate change that Kiribati won't disappear entirely. There is no scenario in which Kiribati doesn't lose islands under rising sea levels. All right, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, we'll see Kiribati lose entire islands. However, if we can hold climate change to 1.5 degrees, then there's some chance Kiribati will still exist as a nation in 2100. So hearing President Tong talk about climate change, it's not very abstract, it's pretty concrete for him and for his people. They've already started to buy land in other countries, so they'll have somewhere to move to when their country goes underwater. So President Kiribati has called for a moratorium on all new coal mines. Strangely, he, like I, agrees that there's no scenario in which we need more coal mines to help tackle climate change. So step one, President Tong has called for a moratorium. Step two, he's written to all world leaders. So David Cameron will have got his letter, I think this week, maybe last week, effectively saying, Dear Prime Minister Cameron, I hear you're serious about tackling climate change. Why don't you join with us in calling for a moratorium on all new coal mines? So far, only 11 countries have agreed, but that's not too bad early in the piece. Nicholas Stern, you might have heard of him, issued a very positive statement saying a moratorium was a very important part of the broad suite of policies we need. Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, a bunch of environmentalists support the moratorium. But let me just end with this point, because it's the one that most people get a bit surprised by. A moratorium on coal mines will primarily deliver benefits to the owners of existing coal mines. Okay? Let me just say that again. It's really simple, but people often don't get it. Banning new coal mines, moratorium on building new coal mines, primarily delivers benefits to people who own existing coal mines. Because by preventing a flood of new supply into the world market, we prevent the coal price falling even further. And preventing the coal price falling even further is quite beneficial for the following groups: people who own coal mines, people who lend money to people who own coal mines, people who own oil and gas, people who own renewables, people that want to build renewables, and people who want to tackle climate change. It's kind of hard to invent a better Venn diagram of overlapping interests than you can get for a moratorium on coal. Again, the main beneficiaries are the incumbents. If you read the newspapers, or the financial papers at all, you'll see that Glencore is in massive trouble at the moment with falling coal prices. A moratorium would probably save them. So we're so used to thinking that everything that's good for the environment is bad for capitalists and everything that's good for capitalists is bad for environmentalists, but actually that's just some of the economic policies. Don't get me wrong. If we could have a global carbon price tomorrow, sign me up, tick, I'm on board for that. But things like carbon prices unite powerful forces against the change in the hope that it will deliver benefits to powerless people in the future. I'd like to think we were capable of doing that, but the last 25 years has taught me we can't. Whereas the moratorium on all new coal mines actually delivers immediate benefits to wealth and power. The main beneficiary are the owners of the biggest and once most profitable coal companies in the world. It just has the unintended consequence that it would also be a fantastic way to stop growth, and let's be clear, it's been growing steadily, the growth in emissions from the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll just wrap up on that point. Again, happy to take questions. But in a nutshell, whereas most of the policy proposals on domestic and the international front unite powerful voices against them in the hope that we'll be well-meaning enough to do things that deliver for people in other countries in the future, a moratorium turns that on its head and says in the short term the main beneficiaries are powerful groups, and in the short term and the long term we all benefit from far lower levels of particulate pollution and of course climate change itself, but they're actually direct benefits for the countries themselves. So on that note I'll wrap it up. Anyone got any questions?
Round of applause first though.
Oh, okay.
It's a small group. The advantage is plenty of time for questions. Show of hands, who's got questions? Someone first, please. Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I don't see anything necessarily wrong with it, because you can then start looking at taxing those who do particularly well on things like coal. You don't have to do this thing on its own. And also, of course, if you keep prices up, then, particularly in the Australian situation and Indonesian, you put a greater incentive for the Chinese to stop building or reduce now, because they're stopping building, as I understand it, their coal power stations, to actually start reducing the number of coal. So you do several things all at the same time. So I don't see any problem with the consortium that you're saying, and sometimes that's the way history works. But you step one step at a time. But it seems to me absolutely essential. We've got to stop digging up coal. And I do think, there are a number of people now in the world who are starting to take this very seriously. And the disinvestment in coal now is picking up quite well. So I just hope it moves to other fossil fuels too very quickly.
Yeah.
I think one of the, and also of course, if you do start doing this, and again the Australian government may rethink its subsidies to coal, which would be another big spin-off for the Australian people, I would have thought, instead of putting their subsidies in something harmful to us all. Perhaps they could use their money for something more useful.
Yeah, no, thanks, and look, you're spot on, and if I didn't say it clearly, I should have. I don't think a moratorium is all we need to do, and I agree entirely. I think it's a great first step, and put another way, I think it's the logical first step, because to introduce carbon prices and global emissions trading schemes before you ban new coal mines doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Like, I've just written a paper called "If You're in a Hole, Stop Digging." It's not rocket science that the first thing you need to do is stop going in the wrong direction. Having decided to not go in that direction, then we need a debate about how to speed up the transition away. But I'd argue that it's kind of not just intellectually dangerous, but politically dangerous to start a conversation about, quote, a transition away from coal when we're simultaneously building the largest mines the world has ever seen.
Ridiculous.
So, look, you can see, and I think a lot of this, there's a lot of kind of theory of change debate in the environment movement around we've got to be positive, we've got to tell people what we're for. So I think there's a lot of impetus to say, well, we're for renewable energy and we're for this. Great, so am I. But we're also, surely we're against building mines that would be bigger than Paris, Berlin and London combined. And yeah, look, as for Australia and the subsidies, I can kind of tell that we're on the right track with this. Glencore has recently criticised the Australian government for potentially subsidising this mine.
For their own survival. Yeah.
I was going to say, the last 10 years when people like myself have talked about the problems with subsidies, Glencore has been strangely silent. But now, and this is an important point, when the coal market was growing, when demand for coal was growing, the coal companies didn't see each other as rivals. They saw the environmentalists as rivals. As long as my new mine got approved and your new mine got approved, and as long as I got my subsidies, I didn't care if you got yours. But now that the demand for coal is flat, leave structural decline out, which is probably going to happen, but even if it's just flat, every new mine is a reduction in my market share and a reduction in my price. So yes, the Australian government is now being pressured by coal companies to not subsidise new entrants. And really that's what the strategy is. This is a game of incumbents versus new entrants rather than greenies versus the entire fossil fuel industry. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No.
There's a question there and then there's a question there.
Do you know what public opinion in Australia is on the coal mines and on moratorium?
Yeah.
Is it something that's being talked about a lot?
Look, no, not really. I mean, so the Australian Institute where I work, we've been kind of talking about these issues for years. It depends on the question you ask people. If you ask people would they like a mine built next door to them, they say no. If you ask people, do you think we should build mines to create jobs for unemployed people, they say yes. Of course, unemployed people don't get jobs in mines, skilled workers do. When we ask people, should we subsidise new coal mines, people say no. We haven't actually surveyed, and the moratorium call, it's really only 5-6 weeks old, and I've spent that time over here overseas. I'm based in London at the moment. Because I think it's actually easier to talk to other countries than to talk to Australia about this at the moment. But I do think Australia notices when other countries sort of talk about these issues. But to give you a sense of it, Newcastle in New South Wales is the largest coal port in the world until these ones get built. Coal employs 5% of people in the Newcastle region. Put another way, 95% of people don't work in coal. And that's the biggest coal mining region in Australia at the moment. The vast majority of those people think that we've either got enough coal mines or too many. Only around 20% of people in that coal mining region think that we need more mines. So that survey question wasn't phrased in terms of a moratorium. It was phrased in terms of, do you think we've got too many mines, not enough mines, about the right amount? The vast majority of people are in the right amount or too many. Not many people actually. Even the people who have some chance of getting a job working in a coal mine, not many of them actually want new mines built. Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, it's a very nice story. I have a lot of sympathy for it. It's very normative, I have to say. So I don't see any possibility in terms of social and political feasibility to introduce a moratorium. I would like it to happen. If we can't even stick to Kyoto targets for reducing carbon price, I don't see any option for a moratorium. I think it is interesting to look at the past and those instances where we have been able to introduce a moratorium. There's a lot of social and political outrage or concern. From biotech, I mean, there's not that many examples. DDT was with massive scandals. So there needs to be more than just a couple of academics saying this is a good idea. But I have a few other complications, or maybe to explain what's going on beyond the green paradox. Or one question, since there's only four really big companies, we can just interviews and ask them why this is happening. So that's just. Because economists sometimes live in sort of a model world which is very rational, but we can also just ask the people, why are you doing this? So that's just more an empirical question. And I know Mark is doing interviews with some of the coal companies, so we could just empirically investigate why they are doing this. So that's one that's more an empirical The second is, of course, political economy and the importance of coal for the Australian economy, which grew from 2% of GDP to about 4.1 in 2011. Probably come down a little bit, but that means it's massively important for the Australian economy, despite all the subsidies. It's in a lot, not so much employment, I agree, because that's been going down, but it's been a massive cash cow. Of course, particularly after the resources boom, it's come down a bit, but it's still very important, and that means also it's politically very important. So it's been a whole, it's almost an entrenched mindset, we need to expand. So the third issue is, of course, the price can go down, but if you are the cheapest one, you will earn a lot of money. And that's, I think, as far as I know, Australia, particularly the thermal coal, is one of the cheapest in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
So they don't, okay, maybe they'll know when the price goes up, that's not going to bother them, but mostly the other ones that are a little bit more expensive. So again, that's not a possible explanation from an economic point of view, more a competitive point of view. It could be entirely rational to expand. If you think we're just a bit cheaper than all the rest, we fuck them over and we get a bigger market share there. So that's rational. I was also wondering about what kind of coal is this, because coal is not one kind, as you know. It's thermal coal, that's more like electricity, that's problematic, but metallurgical coal is probably still going to grow, because we need them for steel, and we are going to build many more ports and buildings and all in China and Asia across all the world. So that market is not going to shrink, probably, the market is going to grow, and as far as I know, it's not really yet a feasible alternative. So I'm not sure what kind of coal this is, and this is another thing that came out of Mark's recent interviews, that they still have probably very long life, at least for the next 20-30 years, in the metallurgical coal, in the thermal coal of electricity. They are facing increasing problems. And then the last point, the fifth point, is of course the problems of CCS still, and I mean that's been going down since the financial crisis, but and almost across the world this problem has not yet materialized. But of course, if that happens somehow in the next 5 or 10 years, it could still mean that coal has a fantastic future. And I'm not sure what they themselves did. Mark, I'm the supervisor. We've been wondering, why did the coal industry not invest more in this? I mean, because if you want to have a future in a low carbon world, that's the only way you can survive. So maybe they underestimated the threat in the mid-2000s, and they're now sort of having to face up to that. So that's maybe, I'm not sure what they currently think with CCS, but that could of course be slightly a complication. So the ice may be melting, but maybe there is some help on the way in terms of CCS, so maybe you can still sell 10 years into the future. So it may be not, if you're the coal industry people, it's maybe not as much of a lost cause. But then again, I'm not sure entirely what their views are on this, and maybe this is something that Mark could look into, what you know about. Some additional complications, I think, to the...
Absolutely, which is why I said I'll just do the simple stuff, and the devil is in the details. Better done in Q&A. Look, I'll forget some, but please remind me. But look, the CCS, it's a moratorium, not a ban. I think as soon as they invent carbon capture and storage that's economic, we could revisit this. My view is it will never happen. The power stations at the moment are optimally sited according to 3 main criteria. Proximity to coal, because it's expensive to transport, proximity to water, because they need a huge amount of water, and proximity to customers, because you minimise the transmission losses. Carbon capture and storage requires a fourth and fundamentally new thing, which is proximity to a safe geological storage for it. So, for example, in Australia, none of the coal-fired power stations in Australia, none are within 400 kilometres of an appropriate disposal site. Right? We've built 30 coal-fired power stations, none of them are viable for carbon capture and storage disposal, let alone the fact that the engineering in them isn't actually retrofittable. So yes, there's still people doing engineering experiments on the coal-fired power stations you build from scratch to be easily able to capture carbon dioxide, which, if there was a disposal place nearby, could be disposed of. And basically the Boulder River one is economic because the CO2 is being pushed into an oil well to increase the amount of oil that can come out. So you've basically got enormous taxpayer subsidies going into research, which are actually increasing the profits of pulling what was once uneconomic oil out of an oil well. So it's a moratorium, not a ban. The day someone can do it, I'll be a happy man. We should get on and do it. But I've been debating the carbon capture and storage optimists in Australia for 15 years. It's always been 5 or 10 years away. You know, I can pull out an interview I did in 1998 with the head of the Coal Association in Australia on television, where he said, "Oh, it's 5 years away." We're just about to put out the 5-year anniversary of that interview to say not a single plant in Australia that's even close. So look, I hope carbon capture works, but it's sort of weird that the science debate and to some extent the economic debate has turned into whether you, quote, believe in carbon capture or storage or not. I don't believe in anything. If it's cheap, great. If it doesn't work or is expensive, then who cares? You know, renewables under all likely scenarios are going to be cheaper than brand new coal-fired power stations with CCS attached. So it's kind of weird that we would say there's a future. Sorry, I don't mean you saying this. I mean a lot of people say there's a big future for coal if we can make CCS work. No, if we can make it work, and after it works, it's still cheaper than the alternatives. Doesn't look like it's going to be. But gee, I hope I'm wrong. No, I don't believe or disbelieve. You know, the question is, does it work yet? The political economy stuff. Look, the New South Wales government, which has the largest coal port in the world in its jurisdiction, makes more money from speeding fines and car registrations than it does from royalties on coal. The coal industry employs less people than McDonald's. The largest NGO in Australia that runs an aged care, string of aged care centres, Uniting Care, church-owned, is a bigger employer than the coal industry. No one would suggest that they're politically powerful.
But you're now talking about employment, and I think in terms of GDP, so finance and balance of payments,
No,
it's big.
GDP
employment figures are not high.
But look, GDP, gross domestic product, total amount of stuff produced within the borders. The coal industry in Australia is 86% foreign owned. So every tonne they dig up counts in Australia's GDP, by definition. Domestic production is produced within our borders. But 86% of the profit goes offshore. In fact, they've been caught in recent years paying very little corporate tax because they've all set up what are called marketing hubs in Singapore. So Glencore Australia sells cheap coal to Glencore Marketing in Singapore, and Glencore Marketing in Singapore can do this amazing thing. They can sell coal at the world price. They market it at the world price. It's a homogeneous product. And strangely, the profits are made in Singapore and the marketing hub rather than in Australia by the mining. So look, it's a long conversation, but there are much bigger industries in Australia that employ far more people, contribute far more to GDP, contribute far more to corporate tax, and get far less subsidies with far less political power. So I agree it's a cultural thing, absolutely. I agree there's a mindset that we just need to build new coal mines, couldn't agree more. But the objective data does not explain the political power of the coal industry. I'll give you a clear example. We were involved in a court case against Rio Tinto, who wanted to expand a small coal mine in the Hunter Valley. They claimed it would create 44,000 new jobs. I argued in court that I thought it would create about 0 new jobs. We won. The mine was blocked. They appealed to the Supreme Court and lost. The global head of coal for Rio Tinto flew from London to Sydney, met with the Premier, and within 2 weeks the law was changed. The law had previously said courts needed to consider economic, social and environmental benefits. After they lost that case, the law was changed to say the court need only consider the economic benefits. The raw power to get a major law like that changed virtually overnight is not compatible with the size of the industry. I'm not saying they don't contribute something to our economy, they do, but
To the political party.
no, to all political parties, it's worse than that. I don't think it's the brown paper bag stuff. But to come back to your first point, and then you might have to remind me of the other
Oh,
ones,
the point
but
about competition, so you get, as long, it's fine if prices go down,
Oh.
because you're cheaper than the rest, that seems
Yeah.
to me quite
oh,
obvious.
no, absolutely, that's my point. These aren't stupid people, but that only holds, like it's a very big gamble to build $3 billion worth of railway line and $3 billion worth of port because you think you're going to be able to sell coal for a long time. So getting the taxpayer to build that upfront infrastructure for you is central to the economics. But once someone else takes all the upfront risk, you're spot on. The marginal cost, the extraction cost of the coal, they'll be profitable. But they're not willing to bet their own money building the infrastructure that it's going to last for the 50 years required to pay it back. So you're spot on about that. They'll be profitable, but they need to push the risk off onto the taxpayer. But now your first point was about the political economy of a moratoria. Again, you're spot on. But understand that I think it'll be Glencore asking for it. I think it's going to be coal companies, not greenies. This isn't going to happen through mass mobilisation of people. I think it's going to be the coal companies saying, all right, we'd like to play end game profitably. We could play kind of, one-on-one deathmatch economics where we both try and destroy each other, but actually all the big kids would be happy to just lock that door and say no one else can come in, and we'll run our mines down over time and we'll keep that mine out.
So who's actually pushing this?
That's Adani. That's the Indian family-owned Adani company.
Okay,
So
not one of the big four.
No. And similarly, you've got Shenhua, which is huge, Chinese coal company. But historically, Shenhua's production's been domestic Chinese. The mines they want to build in Australia would be the first mines they've really built offshore. So, this would almost give them a face-saving reason to walk away from that. They could probably demand a bit of compensation, and someone would be happy to pay.
Metallurgical coal, and then we'll move on to...
This is nearly all thermal coal. So there's thermal coal for making electricity, there's coking coal, metallurgical coal for making steel. This is nearly all the electricity stuff. So plenty of substitutes for this stuff. But you're right about metallurgical.
I don't really know what my question is, so bear with me. But, so I don't really know a lot about coal mining, apart from the fact I am Australian and I follow Australian politics with some shame and morbid interest. But I have done work on sort of resource management more generally in Australia, looked at kind of the histories of resource management, but also worked on mining in the context of a big kind of, I can't even remember what the resource was, but it was various types of things that get put into the homes in Ravensthorpe in the south of Western Australia, which had a similar kind of dynamic with these sort of public-private partnership things. When I was exploring those sorts of issues, we kind of went into the community, because for those of you that don't know about that mine, it was sold to the very, very remote local community that it would be a 25-year mine, and the state, local and federal government invested millions and millions and millions of dollars into these sorts of infrastructures that you've been talking about. And there was a real kind of politics of hope that had emerged around kind of those local economies that was then destroyed when the mine kind of got closed down 8 months after it opened, because they basically worked out it wasn't financially viable. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, not try and take away from the importance of coal, but talking about if you thought about that in terms of the history of resource extraction as part of the Australian economy, and how that kind of interplays with sort of local politics and hopes and economies and things.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and I guess, and some of my thinking on this, takes a leaf out of the kind of post-colonial studies kind of book, because I do think in Australia there's a very strong belief that we need to develop.
Yeah.
And these mines are often, you listen to we need to develop Northern Australia, and the only way to develop it, who else is offering to develop it? If the mining companies don't develop it, who will? It's this real frontier mentality that if we're scared of our big continent, and if we don't fill it up with something, then someone else will, or So I do think that is an important part of Australian culture. I do think that it's interesting talking about this in Manchester. I mean, Mark and I were talking about the incredible structural change that happened in Manchester, moving from manufacturing to a lot of that being offshore, and now new things coming back. Similarly, I grew up in Newcastle. Newcastle's biggest employer used to be BHP Steel Mill. And when it shut down, 20,000 people lost their jobs in a city of 250,000 people, so it's pretty big. And everyone thought that would be the end of Newcastle. Some would say it was the beginning of Newcastle. No, I mean that the economy is doing really quite well, and people don't die of asthma, and it's a much nicer place to live. So I guess I think Australian politics, and this sort of comes back to your point about the mindset. Let me use another example. Tasmania, about 500,000 people live in Tasmania. The logging industry is widely considered to be the biggest industry in Tasmania. It's tiny, actually. Newsagents employ more people. It's by far the most visible industry in Tasmania. It's the loudest industry. And the big fights between greenies and loggers have kind of put it on the front page of Tasmania's papers for 30 years. But people have confused the size of the fight with the size of the industry. So in Tasmania, the Tasmanian government loses $30 million a year selling logs that it never bought. Right? The trees grow for free on state-owned land. Right? It's government land, trees grow on it, they chop the trees down, they sell them to paper companies, and they lose $30 million on the transaction. I mean, that takes real skill. Year after year, to lose $30 million selling trees you didn't buy. But anyone that wanted votes at the next election in Tasmania would offer to do more of it. So these little towns, unfortunately, they've often been so abandoned, there is such a lack of hope, that I think the minerals companies or the resource extraction sector are uniquely good at politics in Australia, because they offer hope. That's their trick. I'll bring hope to this poor little town that happens to be in a marginal seat that both parties want to win. I'm the only one offering hope to these people. Now, hope don't come cheap. I just need you to build all my upfront costs. And if you would do that for me, if you would build the road, if you would build the rail, if you would build the electricity supply, if you would build the water treatment works, I would be willing to come and make a profit for as long as it's profitable to do so. And the day it's not, I'll be out.
The case of Ravensthorpe was literally 8 months
Yeah.
until 25 years.
So, I mean, I flipped this on its head because I've had a big fight, by big I mean long-lasting and visible, with the Minerals Council of Australia about the definition of subsidies. And they say, look, building a rail line's not a subsidy, it's infrastructure. Building a port's that's not subsidy, it's an infrastructure. So here's my thought experiment. I say to politicians, look, I've got this great idea, I want to build this beautiful resort in remote Queensland. No one's going to, people are going to come from all around the world, they're going to bring tourism dollars, and we're going to get tax out of it, we're going to create jobs for local Indigenous people. It's going to be fantastic, this hotel. I just need you to build an airport, a port, a road, a water supply, an electricity supply, and water treatment works. And if you can do that, I'll bring the hotel. Right? It's a subsidy. But the mining industry have just been fantastic, sadly, at offering hope. And to spin that on its head, they've been so good at it because no one else is offering hope to these same towns. No one's showing up with any other vision for them. And I'm sitting here saying how cynical it is that they'd exploit that. But the other side of that coin is, well, how bad is it that no one else could even be bothered? So, yeah, I think hope is actually the key word in your question. Sorry, that was a long answer, but they actually offer hope. And good on them for doing that. I just think you could get a lot more hope at a much lower price without making Kiribati sink.
Question here and another question there.
So I was just thinking about the main proposal you suggest today. Obviously, it would be part of the portfolio of policies possibly, but the one you talked about today is obviously the moratorium on new coal mines.
Yeah.
But you've recognised that will actually help to, well, that will favour existing coal mine owners. And the way that policy will work is obviously if you keep the production down, drive up the price, ultimately that will then in turn drive down the consumption, which is where after all the actual emissions are reduced.
Yeah.
But if you, why not simply focus on the consumption itself, say introduce policies which probably pie in the sky really, but reduce, if there could be an international agreement on reducing coal-fired power generation. Why not focus on a policy like that as opposed to...
Because that hasn't worked. Because for 25 years, people have talked about... You're right, intellectually, they're the two sides of the same coin. Politically, what I'm talking about brings powerful people on board. What you're talking about pisses off powerful people. And for 25 years, literally my entire adult life, we've talked about that and it hasn't happened yet. That's why I started with, since the UNFCCC agreed in 1990 that here's what we're going to do, emissions have grown 50%. So, yeah, of course, if the two sides, the economists have thought that price and quantity were substitutable and you could either focus on price or focus on quantity. Economists have liked focusing on price for a whole bunch of methodological reasons. 20 years ago, I probably would have shrugged my shoulders and said, doesn't matter. You're right, let's do it your way. But after so many years of failing spectacularly to do it, I think we need to do simple stuff. Like say, does anyone really think that we need to build that? Because that hasn't been approved yet.
But you say, in some countries it has worked. Of course, the United States being the primary example, what coal consumption has been going down.
Yeah.
Not at all because of a carbon tax, I think that's an economist illusion, but
No.
because of innovation policy.
Well, because
Because there was an alternative, indeed, fracking.
Yeah.
So, I'm an innovation scholar, Schumpeter already said, industries don't die because of taxes or they play a role, but usually it's the fact that there is an alternative which replaces it. I did a whole project on the destabilization of existing regimes, and the hypothesis was if you get through taxes and policies and social movement, if you get the industry to decline, then the alternatives can go faster. And we looked at coal in the UK throughout the 20th century, because it was used for everything, cooking, showering, all these things. And what we found was there were anti-smoke movements and lobbies from the late 19th century. There were all these debates about smoke and pollution and the big smoke and all these kind of things that led to absolutely nothing. So the social, or a little bit of efficiency. It wasn't until you got gas and electricity, which led to a whole new vision of the household, so there had to be alternatives, and then it was nuclear power, that people started to move away from coal. So I think there are examples, there are probably more than the US. In Western countries, some of the, as you know, has been tailoring off the emissions. The US, even in Europe. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I don't think it's come from a carbon tax.
No, I don't think it's coming
if
from
you read
carbon
IPCC, I'm always that's dominated by economists who make models. There's now a bit of a change in the IPCC that people actually maybe need to do more innovation to stimulate the alternatives, because that's maybe his point. Then you can sort of, well, if you have alternatives, then we will just consume less coal, and then it will disappear.
Look, I agree. And think of it this way: the problem in inverted commas with climate change is there kind of is a deadline. For industries, as we move from beta to VHS, there was no deadline where we had to get to somewhere by. The objective science says there's a deadline. So I agree that innovation more than I don't think I said, and I certainly don't believe that carbon tax or any government policy in the US drove their emissions down. Agree entirely, it was coal seam gas. But the scientists tell us that we just can't afford to burn this coal. And the renewable energy costs are plummeting, battery storage are plummeting. But if we build this and we incur those fixed costs, this is going to be the cheapest coal the world's ever seen. And unlike most innovation industry transition issues, the reason we're trying to transition from one industry to another is not better consumer benefit, but to solve a scientific problem that says we can't take a dose of poison that big. So usually I'd agree entirely with you, but for 20 years we've said, oh, we're already overdosing, we need to do something. That said, I think that the quicker we ban new coal mines, the more innovation will be stimulated in alternatives, because people think, oh, this is serious, it is going to happen. We do, you know, there will be money to be made out of the non-coal alternatives. So the deadline is the big problem. You know, other than that, I wouldn't care. Like when I was saying to Mark, when I first heard about this 25 years ago as an undergrad, I thought, oh, that's interesting, we'll have that solved and I don't have to worry about it. You know, but the politics have got in the way of the introduction of sensible policy for so long. But actually, to come back to, you know, you said consumption's the real problem. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. One of the reasons that countries like Australia and America and Europe have reduced their emissions per person is they outsourced manufacturing to countries like China, right? So we said, so think of it this way, Australia sends coal to China, it sends iron ore to China, it buys steel back off China, and we say, look at those Chinese generating all those emissions.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, a lot of the innovation has come from pushing consumption from the consuming countries to developing countries, which in and of itself is not a problem. But, you know, I don't think, again, 25 years ago, that when people said, kind of arbitrarily, let's focus on the consumption side of the ledger, they would have anticipated the massive outsourcing of emission-intensive production.
Most people say we haven't reduced carbon emissions at all if we take that on board.
No, that's my point, you know.
Hang on, we're losing track of where we're up to. There is a lady who's had her hand up.
Yeah.
We are also going to the pub after this, the Crowbar, so the debate can continue there. Other than this lady, is there anyone else who's got a question? Speak now, going once, going twice. Final question goes to you.
It's less of a question, more of a follow-on from the previous question, so I'm not sort of like it's relevant anymore. But I'm studying science communication, so I'm interested in is what people think about the science and what people think about policy. So I just wanted to sort of clarify what I asked you about the public. You were saying that people aren't really in favour of it. So are you thinking that in general, public opinion is a tricky concept, but in general public opinion is that we don't want more mines, but in local places that have been talking roads abandoned, they are for the coal mines because they bring hope, or are they for the coal industry in general, or is it that specific, I want that thing to happen because I can't see any alternative to myself getting a job?
I hope you come to the pub, because my real answer would involve LBJ and my favourite book on politics that has a chapter in it called Always Agree in Principle. But the short answer is progressives often want to win in principle and companies want to win in practice. So getting people to agree to principle statements we often think is a step closer to winning. So, oh look, more and more people agree that, you know, we've got enough coal mines. People who own coal mines don't care what you agree about in principle. They agree whether they can get their new one built in the specific or not.
Yeah.
So I think that your question kind of highlights a real kind of tension in kind of our version of how democracy works and how politics works. But it's frankly irrelevant what people think in principle.
Yeah.
What matters are the laws that get made, the laws that get enforced, and the cheques that get written. And plenty of countries, my own included, in principle want to tackle climate change, in principle are committed to not to subsidising mines. At the G20, all countries wrote to the G20 listing the subsidies they make and promising to phase them out. We wrote straight back saying, easy, we don't have any, so there's nothing to phase out. So in principle, we don't subsidise mines. In principle, we want to tackle climate change. In principle, we balance environmental, social and economic factors when making planning decisions. And in practice, we say yes to any miner who shows up and wants to build a mine.
And we give them subsidies.
And we subsidise
It's the
them
same
showing
in
up.
this country.
Of course, every country's got their own foibles. Mine just happens to be coal. So I guess what I'm trying to say, so from a communications point of view, we've kind of won. We won years ago. The problem is we lose every day. And we've been losing for 25 years. And to flip that on its head, I say this in Australia a lot, I don't know how your politics works over here, but I've never seen full-page ads and mass petitions saying tax cuts for the rich now. But what do we accidentally do all the time?
All the time.
There's no, you know, and there's no public campaign for it. There's no politician coming out saying, today I'm cutting taxes for the rich. You know, and the legislation isn't called the Cutting Taxes for Rich People Bill 2015. They just kind of accidentally win again and again and again. While in principle everyone says we need to make, you know, more, we need equity, and my government's committed to giving everyone a fair go. So beware the principle. You know, don't get me wrong, comms is very important. I think a big part of the climate failure was comms related, but a big part was misunderstanding the role of comms. Because the other side weren't trying to win a comms battle. They were just trying to not lose a legislative battle. And they've succeeded in not losing.
You're extremely clear. One of the clearest lecturers I've heard, actually, for a long time. Credit for that.
If only Australians agreed with you.
Okay, and if only Australians agreed, this one does. Okay.